Alright everyone, we start off today talking about the upswelling of support for Cuban dissidents. Specifically, a lot of people are mentioning the use of tech to actually help people there organize protests and essentially overthrow the commie regime that they're suffering under. I like the idea, free speech, free expression, the use of tech whenever possible to organize for political and social reasons. I just wish that the same people applauding this, including people like Brian Stelter, would aim the same logic at dissident movements and reform and activism within the Western world. Of course, Cuba being part of the Eastern Bloc, despite being in the Caribbean region. I wish that they would stop being hypocrites. It's very ironic. I'll get into it a little bit further. Down below, though, first and foremost on YouTube, if you're watching this video there will be 4 links to other video hosting sites that I use. Keep in mind, I make 4 videos every day. Only 2 of them actually end up on YouTube, partially because of censorship and verboten topics, partially because of algorithmic manipulation that Google is now involved with. Now, link in the description, archived, of course. When we look at the United States, Canada, etc., right now we see a massive amount of tech censorship from the big tech firms, which is why new tech exists. This is why I've got those alternatives to YouTube. This is why I use Minds. This is why I use Subscribestar. I'm on Gab and Parler. There's a reason for these things. People in the first world, the so-called liberal, free speech-loving, freedom, eagles, and apple pie sort of countries, are censored heavily as well. We've seen over the last few years the number of people, the sheer number of people who have been banned off of platforms, who have been suspended temporarily off of platforms, certainly algorithmic demotion of material that's not considered, it's not considered right think, is huge. Now, does this compare to Cuba? Not on the surface. In the nation of Cuba, if you express the wrong views, you get reprimanded. Maybe that means you disappear, Stalinist style. Maybe your whole family disappears. Maybe you just get beaten up in an alley and have a stapler applied to your scrotum or something like that. It's a tin horn regime. Communism is inevitably and inherently brutal. There's never been a commie regime that hasn't included massive human rights violations. But I would say that the outsourcing to big tech or to media sources, which regularly and routinely defame and deprave reality, by the U.S. government or by the Canadian government or some of these other Western nations, their civic systems, their legal systems, is basically the same. In Cuba, if you've got the wrong views, you're not going to be able to find anyone to give you a job. How are you going to find a job? You're a dissident. The Castros or their offshoots don't like you, and so it's going to be kind of difficult to find any friends and allies. In a Western nation, like say in the United States, if you get banned off of too many big tech sites, you essentially disappear. There are some workplaces that will require you to have certain social media actually to use them. We've got people literally right now, and train the government, attempting to influence even private messaging, like through SMS and stuff like that, for like COVID fact-checking. How is it any different? The end result is fundamentally the same. Sure, maybe you don't get killed, but dog whistles for you to be roughed up, maybe, those aren't necessarily non-routine. We see it all the time on leftoid Twitter and places like that. We even see it from the U.S. government. We had our own representative, AOC, calling to put people on lists if they didn't accept the election outcome. Literally, we're going to have a list of these people. Basically, these are the verboten people. They shouldn't be in polite company. That was, I can't remember, I think that was Maxine Waters, if I remember correctly, who said that. Again, the end result is similar. Okay, you didn't die, but you've essentially, as a person, you've died, and try finding work. You're known as the extremist, the QAnon tinfoil hat crazy. You're known as the MAGAT orange Trumpanzee lover or something like that, and it becomes a deep social issue. We see this with COVID, with them trying to develop COVID passports and things to make second-class citizens out of people for their topical medical differences of opinion. I wish that the same tech firms, Twitter, Google at this point and so forth, openly musing about helping the Cubans liberate themselves through access to internet technology by trying, especially from the state of Florida, to sort of force the Cuban regime to allow people to use these sites, because, you know, people in Cuba, they have smartphones and shit too now. None of them want to re-platform all the people that have been silenced by, in a de facto sense, the U.S. government or the Canadian government. Now, in some Western nations, like in the EU and Canada and stuff, the government censors people explicitly, especially in places like the UK and Germany. Again, tin horn authoritarian states, I would call them. In the United States, it's different. It's done by big tech especially, but the problem is the government leans on them. They platform government figures. They openly politically collude. They kicked the President of the United States off of multiple big tech sites with the lie that he was trying to start a coup. How is this kind of interference, this kind of political chicanery, any different from what we really see in Cuba? When Stelter the other day made his tweet, and he's like, well, authoritarian regimes will often try to stop internet access as a way to silence dissidents and prevent people from being free and voicing their opinions. Okay, that's true. You're effectively calling the entire U.S. Democratic Party, parts of the Republican Party, and their big tech cronyist cohorts authoritarians. Now, I agree with you. You're correct, but the hypocrisy and the irony is definitely there. I wish that there were moves within the U.S. government especially, where all these big tech sites inevitably are based, to provide platforms for dissidents within the United States. I get algorithmically demoted on every big tech site that I'm part of. Essentially, you're de facto muted when you go around the site and attempt to communicate with other people. In some cases, the muting is by the actual user page. For instance, the Young Turks have muted me. I can appear in their live chat and troll Jank all I want to, but if I make a comment under one of the videos, nobody else can see it. It's very interesting how that happens. And that sort of haranguing has been enabled by YouTube. It's been enabled by Facebook and similar sites. Zuckerberg openly partners at this point with elements of the U.S. government. In some cases, the government is literally asking these people to censor material. Now, they do it under the guise of disinfo, but again, how is this different? If you rob someone of their livelihood, you take someone, they have strong political opinions. Their livelihood relies upon making political opinions. They get a podcast or something. They're not necessarily capable, because if they become well known enough, they're not necessarily capable of holding like what you would conceive of as a normal job unless they move out to the middle of nowhere where nobody fucking has TV or radio or anything like that and couldn't possibly have heard anything about them. They essentially become a non-entity. That's not much different from what you see in authoritarian regimes. You might as well just execute the person because you have taken their ability to live a normal life away. We even see banks deplatforming people. Oh, you have problematic views. You're not allowed to have credit line. You're not allowed to get a loan. How is that different from China's social credit score system? The only difference is that it isn't a central authority directly administering it, but that central authority, which is Western governments, does collude with the sites that are causing that to happen, does collude with the banks causing it to happen. For the most part, independent content creators are one ADL hit piece away from losing their livelihood in some cases, which forces them in turn to self-censor, at least on mainline tech sites. It's fascinating how even some of the conservatives and say, well, those Cuban commies, they don't have freedom, we should give them freedom. Okay, why don't we worry about freedom actually in the United States? You know, the land of the free and the home of the brave, as opposed to being a slave. Wouldn't it be nice for people to be able to engage in public discourse in the de facto modern square without worrying about what the Cubans are doing? They seem perfectly capable of organizing on their own, probably already are intelligent enough to understand how to get past the censorship of their government, clearly have, and are organizing as a result of this. What's happening there is very sad. Hopefully communism does go the way of the dinosaur there, as it should everywhere else, and it should be buried in the dustbin of history because it consistently and totally has failed. But we've got similar problems in the Western world, in the so-called free world, that also need to be addressed, and I just don't hear many people in Congress talking about it. Cruz brings it up occasionally, does nothing. Rand Paul yammers away on it, but isn't taken seriously. Trump talked about it, but then he got himself completely silenced on mainline tech. Now he uses, Rumble and shit like that, which, I mean, it's great. Certainly it helps one of these main alternatives to grow, but we shouldn't even have to go through that fucking horseshit. U.S. firms should be competing to see who can be the most platformer-friendly. They should be abiding by the basic premise of 230 that was initially incepted to allow them to exist as large corporations in the first place. Instead, they're biting the hand that feeds them, and Congress really, because they're sucking on the teat of big tech, is letting them get away with it, and then you end up with a situation where libertarians and populists, hell, even feminists who believe in chromosomes and gender chromosomes, are routinely deplatformed. And they're not even like, it's not like in Cuba you might conceive of a dissident as someone, they want to overthrow the state or something. We'd call it an insurrection, I suppose. No, people with topical differences of opinion from whatever Joe Biden or AOC happens to say, or the rhinocons certainly, about science, especially with regards to medicine or anything gender-related. Differences of opinion in basically anything. Libertarians are considered extreme for expressing views that would have been considered sacrosanct and self-evident as little as 50 years ago in some cases. Again, when they start coming after third-wave feminists or gay people who are like, well, this pansexual stuff, I don't know about it, it's just a little bit bizarre that we're worrying about what the Cuban government is doing. Let the Cuban government collapse on its own. It's not like socialists are capable of running a goddamn economy. Again, fairly self-evident. That's about all. Peace out.